All right,
Hey everyone.
guys. Adjust my camera.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. We'll get started in another minute or two.
Chelsea, how's New York going? How's the weather there?
It's good. It finally is a bit sunny and the air quality alerts have stopped bombarding my phone. So there's that. How about you? You're over in Seattle, right?
Yeah, I can't get much farther away from you, but
I know, right?
it actually rained
Still
for the
early
first
for
time.
you.
The early bird gets the worm. So that's why I'm a believer in starting on time. So we're giving people 2 minutes grace, right?
Justin, I feel like most of our calls don't start on time, like you and I. Maybe it's because I'm always late.
We're going to do good about getting this one launched in a short order.
All right. Awesome. I say we give everyone another like 30 seconds or so. What do you think?
I like it.
Okay. Great.
Gives me time to get a few more sips of coffee, and it's 8 a.m. out here on the West Coast, so
Ooh, yeah.
We're still into our first cup.
I also need to apologize in advance. My dog has been barking at random things all morning, so if you do hear him, sorry about that. Awesome. Should we get going? What do you think?
I say 2 minutes after, which is in about. We ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, Chelsea, you want to lead us off with quick intros and let's jump in?
Yeah, perfect. Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to talk about combating ransomware in OT environments. I'm Chelsea Haynes. I lead product marketing at Clarity, and I am joined by the lovely Justin Woody, who's our Senior Director of Security Strategy.
There you go. It's going to be fun.
It is going to be fun. Let's take a quick look at our agenda. So today we're going to talk about how we got to the current state of ransomware, talk about some cool historical facts, some scary historical facts. And from there, we're going to talk about looking at ransomware through a risk lens. Justin, I know you mentioned that you're kind of excited to talk about that in a more theoretical approach, right?
Yeah, I think, if you look at a lot of different people's talks and webinars and other environments, they're all talking about the specific ransomware. Like, what are the TTPs around the ransomware? What's the code? What are the attributions? And I think we're going to take a little different nuanced approach to it, much more theoretical approach, right? Instead of, we all kind of know who's out there and what the groups are, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But the idea about how you pivot as an organization around the ransomware problem is where we want to focus in today.
Sounds good to me.
Nope. Let's jump in.
And then at the end, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Let's go.
All right, let's go. So, oops. All right, ransomware, how we got here. So what everyone's seeing on the screen now, these are some highlights from Clarity's annual survey that we conducted, just trying to better understand from a random sampling of 1,100 security practitioners across all industries, all countries, generally larger companies, how they're dealing with ransomware, how they're confronting it, and what's going on. These are some highlights you're seeing up on the screen right here.
So Chelsea, we were looking at this and prepping a little bit, and I think the big stat that stood out to me was, all right, I think there's IT impacts. We're all well aware of that. The OT impacts are surprising in general. Maybe we can get to that, but the idea about this 27% that bridge both, did you get any insights on that when you were doing the survey?
Yeah, and so since this was an anonymous random survey, unfortunately that meant that I couldn't actually talk to these people who had this answer.
Fair.
But what we do think is that, we know that a lot of ransomware attacks, including many of the big ones that we've all seen publicized in recent months and years, originate in the IT environment before then pivoting into OT. And in many cases, OT is not directly targeted, but it's collateral damage. I think the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened, 2021, that comes to mind as an example where IT was targeted, IT was hit, and then as a precaution, and also because my understanding is that the company didn't have full visibility into OT, they weren't aware of what the impact could be, it was shut down. And so still impacted nonetheless, even though the attack started in IT.
So Chelsea, I have a couple more questions to go along here, but I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to either talk to them here, or Chelsea, we were going to follow up on some stuff too, weren't we?
Yes. Thanks for that. I totally forgot about that.
So sounds good. So Chelsea, as you guys did the survey, did you guys talk about, like, I know this is not necessarily directly impacting our talk, but I'm always curious if people are paying or not paying and how much it was. Did you get any info about that?
Yeah, so it was actually pretty surprising to see roughly 60% of the people who were hit did pay the ransom. And these were pretty sizable ransoms. We're talking in the, mid six figures and up from there.
Mid six figures.
Yeah, pretty big.
All right. Maybe I'm in the wrong business, but okay.
I know, right?
Interesting. So Chelsea, as we look kind of on the right side of the graph about the different verticals that were impacted, like I think you're calling out the manufacturing and energy sectors. Any insights that came through the survey about those two? It's somewhat obvious about why those two are hit, but nuanced or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that all of these industries that were hit and did have OT impacted, what they all have in common is that their tolerance for downtime is pretty low, right? The amount of money that they stand to lose, even if they're down for 1 hour, can be, again, mid six figures and up. So from the attacker's perspective, this type of company is probably going to be far more likely to pay the ransom because that ransom is going to be probably a lot cheaper than what they would otherwise lose from being down.
Interesting.
One of a few factors, I think, but that does seem to be the big one at stake here.
Any other thoughts we can pull out of this, or are we jumping ahead here?
I think let's jump ahead. I do have a few thoughts on this that we'll pull back into the deck, a few slides down the line, but I think for now we're good.
Cool.
All right. So now we're going to take a quick historical look at how we got to where we are with ransomware today. Want to take us away, Justin?
Oh, right. I thought you were taking this slide, but
actually, no. A piece of context. I think this is interesting. So this is a screenshot of Google Trends. I took this, a couple days ago when I was making these slides, but it's a look at external interest in ransomware as a topic over the past, 6 years or so. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that in 2017, when the pretty infamous WannaCry and Petty attacks hit, that's referring to that big spike up at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't be too surprising, although I will say, I'm probably biased as a person who's worked in security for too long. I was expecting there to be quite a few more spikes in the years since then, but the media is going to report on what they want to report on. So there you go.
Yeah, it did. As you look at the trend line, it's kind of leveled off or gradually increased, but not to the spiky nature as we saw early on. Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Also note that as the years progress, you can see that, the new, I would say, newsworthy attacks weren't getting nearly as much attention. Even though looking at the bottom, the average ransom in that year was going up quite a bit. Can you speak to that at all, Justin?
Well, I mean, it looks like it's doubling or tripling or whatever year after year, and I think it goes to two things. One, I think it goes to sophistication of the actors, right? And two, I think as any organization, people tend to grow things, and I think we've seen the idea of ransomware as a service, right? Started off as people developing code and they're making a few bucks. But now there's real money to be made here, right? If you look at that number on the far right, you can see it's 1.5. That's a billion, right? 1.5 billion?
Million.
Million. Oh, average, right?
Yeah, that's the average. I was going to say a billion might be, whew. A little
That's a
too
real
ambitious on the part of the attacker.
that's a real moneymaker.
Yeah.
I think if you look at ransomware as a service, the idea that you don't have to do all the work behind it. You have to be you're the buyer, right? And you come into an organization, you say, hey, look, I'm interested in having a framework set up for me, right? You guys do all the hard labor, and once you guys have things set up and we sign an agreement and we have the paperwork ready to go, I'm going to tell you what victims I want to target. I'm going to give you the ransomware demands and really give the business justification for it from a malicious, criminal's perspective. And they're going to say, this is what we want to do. And then they're going to say, let's do it. And they're going to launch it. And what's interesting is there's a couple of payment methods, right? You can either pay one time, you can pay as a subscription, or you can have a joint revenue opportunity between them. And it's something we hear all the day, regularly through ransomware as a service, but also they kind of took their cues from the business world on how they did this, which I find very intriguing.
That is intriguing. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I think at step 2, right there, they have this thing launching, it's out there, and then like, hey, how successful am I, right? And they can start gauging their campaign success, and if it's really good, they'll keep pushing it. And if it's not, they can kind of redirect it, and it allows this flexibility from the ransomware as a service that we've seen, and that's why these numbers double and triple year after year.
Over time, the attackers have learned how to just make more money out of this, right? Become more profitable.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the what CISA's publishing in terms of how much like Lockbit the group is making, right? They're just the back end for it, right? They do all kinds of stuff, right? They do third parties, they do almost like OEMing and other things. But if you look at how they think about a business, according to CISA, these guys are bringing anywhere between $30 and $50 million ARR a year into their business from having ransomware as a service, which is a phenomenal number, right? And
phenomenal for them.
Yeah, it's mind blowing that you can have a illegal business that everybody knows about that is generating that much cash.
Yeah, that's insane. I'd be so curious to see how that compares to like the most successful drug dealers, other types of bad people doing bad things. Not my line of work though. So
yeah. So
awesome.
There's some thoughts of why we see this escalating.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So now that we have some background information, we do want to talk more about the risk of ransomware. What is it? How do you reduce it? From a theoretical perspective, what components are involved? How can we impact those? So taking a look at the basic formula. So what everyone's seeing now, this is like at its probably simplest form, this is how you measure risk. And this is, of course, in a cybersecurity context, but this could be applied to anything. You could break down these buckets to think about your risk of getting a sunburn, your risk of getting caught in a thunderstorm, really anything. And so approaching it like this, these are the 3 different variables that ransomware or anything else would fit into to impact that risk.
Look, Chelsea, I was a physics guy in college, and I like to express all my things in equations. So this whole idea about equations gets me real excited. If you take 1 to 0, your risk goes away. This is kind of the theoretical approach that I think is particularly relevant for organizations.
You're right. I was not a physics person, but I do know enough math to know that any number times 0 is always going to be 0. So your theory is correct. If we get rid of one of these, truly get rid of it, risk goes away.
All right, so let's go talk about each one of these. Let's jump in.
Let's do it. All right. So the first thing we're going to take a look at here is the threat variable. So broadly speaking, this encompasses 2 things. You have the ransomware itself, then you have the ransomware attacker. And so, go ahead, Justin, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think you're defining risk threats here a little different. From my incident response background, I'm always about hey, what APT group is coming after me, right? Is that the same here, or are you expressing it a little differently?
Well, the people involved are definitely part of it. But if we think about what it would take to eliminate the threat, which, to be clear, I'm not talking about eliminating people. That's not what we're doing here. But there are two different buckets, and you need to have both buckets in order for this threat of ransomware to even exist, right? In order for it to be a thing that you were worried about, in order for it to be a thing that you're willing to go to a webinar about, right? And so if we take a closer look at these two buckets, like on the left, if you were to completely eradicate the world of ransomware variants, if you were to hunt down every server where they exist, get rid of it, if you were to, for example, shut down the entire internet, yes, that in theory would eliminate the threat. No one's going to do that. You can't do that. It's not going to work, right? Thinking now about the attackers, again, I'm not suggesting we do anything to harm people, but if we drill into this a bit further, there are two things that an attacker needs to have in order to carry out an attack, right? They need to be willing to do it. Mm-hmm. They also need to be able to do it. And so if we look at these buckets a little bit more closely, thinking about their willingness, their motivation to actually execute a ransomware attack, I mean, one thing we know by now is that in nearly all cases, that motivation is financial, right? Surprise, surprise. Looking at those numbers on the earlier slides about there are ransoms that are being paid millions of dollars, like that's definitely a factor in motivating someone to want to do this. And also in many cases, there is some nation state involvement. And this doesn't necessarily mean that Russia, for example, is out there directing their own citizens to carry out ransomware attacks. I don't doubt that that's happened, but in many cases, it's that certain countries, certain governments are known for just turning a blind eye to that activity. And so it's a lot easier for it to persist, among their own citizens. And that's typically as long as those citizens or those people that live there aren't actually targeting businesses in that country, right? So willingness to attack, largely financially motivated, like definitely corresponds with some activity or I guess lack of activity from certain nation states. On the other end, an attacker who is motivated to carry out an attack also has to be actually able to do it, okay? And I think this is part of why the ransomware as a service model that you mentioned before is having such a big impact right now, because it vastly lowers the barrier to entry. Anyone can do it. Well, not anyone, but anyone who has like reasonable technical abilities can do it. These services are built with kits that come with instructions, that come with training manuals. You can make it as easy as possible for anyone who is like willing to spend the money to go and execute an attack, right? These attackers also like need to be able to get their hands on ransomware, whether it's ransomware as a service kit, whether it's the ransomware itself. Like these types of things are typically available on illicit forums online, illicit marketplaces, parts of the internet that are inaccessible for most of us, things like encrypted messaging platforms, all those dark, scary places. These things are prevalent, right? So you can access it, you can use it. You also, again, need the financial infrastructure to carry out an attack, whether it's a Bitcoin wallet, whether it's your cryptocurrency of choice. Like you need to be able to receive ransom payments, and so the financial infrastructure has to be in place. Okay, so I'm going to admit right now, like out of all the three variables, getting rid of or even meaningfully impacting the threat is tough. It's like out of our three ones, it's the toughest one. And I'll say, like, despite that, there are a couple of things that each of us can do to help chip away at it. But as far as eliminating it, that's going to be tough.
So Chelsea, like if I look at the willingness to attack, right, the nation states that we started talking about here, like they're not in the Western, world or some of we have crime in like the U.S., for example, right? Yes. And why don't we have? What are your thoughts about not having ransomware as a service out of the U.S.? We obviously have the capability to do it, but honestly,
I think that we probably do. First, it's important to note that I could only fit so many flag logos, flag icons on this slide. But the four that you have up there, we've got Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran. Those are like the most commonly associated nation states with ransomware attacks. But there are folks in the US that are doing this for sure. It's it's tough to like attribution itself is always tough. But the fact that a lot of this stuff is occurring on these illicit forums, on encrypted messaging platforms, tracking down who's doing it and from where can be difficult.
Yeah, I think some of the policies and rules you get thrown in prison, like if you
Yeah.
get caught, I think are pretty significant in the U.S. compared to maybe Iran.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think part of it too is, and I think I mentioned this before, but certain governments are known to turn a blind eye to this. The U.S. is not one of those. So, yeah. Okay, awesome. So we know that getting rid of the threat is near impossible. But despite that, again, there are a couple of things that each of us can do, even as individuals. And the big thing is public policy. And so, again, little things to impact public policy. Like we're talking about doing things that will get like issues on the policy agenda and drive meaningful change in ways that will impact a threat actor's willingness and or ability to carry out an attack. So, I mean, as we just touched on, like certain nation states are notorious for turning a blind eye to ransomware. I've heard many discussions, many even like proposals of policies that would impose sanctions on certain countries as a way to put pressure on them to, stop covering it up, right? To take action on the folks that are doing these things like on their own soil. Beyond that, I've also heard suggestions for, regulating, like more closely regulating cryptocurrency to make it more difficult for threat actors to exchange funds for illicit things, with impunity. I mean, beyond that, like a lot of this comes down to just sharing information with ransomware, sharing information about ransomware with your peers, making sure that awareness of the issue is up there. Like thinking about that Google Trends screenshot we showed earlier. I mean, like from the external media perspective, like reports of ransomware haven't really changed that much, like over the past few years. It clearly doesn't mean it's not happening. Tons of it's happening. Like that random survey we did, I did not expect out of 1,100 people, it was like, 80% had faced an attack. That's a lot. And so I think like doing what you can to raise awareness by engaging in like information sharing groups, like the ISACs are great. Also being civically engaged, voting, if you want to get ambitious, like call your public officials, do things like that to make sure that this issue is, elevated on their agendas, they're aware of it, that they are, more likely to actually do something about it. I mean, beyond that, like if you do get hit, it's important to report it. I mean, at the very least, this will help law enforcement take action, not just to help you. Yes, like they will help you, but beyond that, this enables them to conduct their own investigation into the attackers. Like reports of attacks have also helped like lead to things like the takedowns of certain marketplaces, arrests of certain actors that are engaged in these activities. And so like, on one hand, the argument is, well, new illicit forums, marketplaces frequently pop back up, new actors pop back up. It's a game of whack-a-mole. That's always happening. But at the very least, like doing all these things together is the only way that we're going to be able to drive any meaningful progress in this regard.
Yeah, I think in the U.S. like that, the thought that if you're critical infrastructure, there's some reporting requirements. If you do get breached, I think that's a big step forward. I think in terms of developing mind share and kind of herd protection around it. So I think that's really good. And if that requirement doesn't fit on you as an organization, it definitely kind of sticking your neck out a little bit for the greater good. And I think we as a society, I think you kind of need to be challenged to do that.
Yeah, definitely. All right, it's about playing a long game too. So with that, we're going to talk about a variable, the next one that thankfully gives us a bit more to work with in terms of how each of us individually can affect it.
Yeah, look, when I saw vulnerability, Chelsea, I got really excited because I vulnerability management, that's right on my wheelhouse. That's job security because there's like thousands coming out every day. I know I'll never be out of work. But when I think about this, I think of CVEs, CVSSs, the EPSS, the known exploitable vulnerabilities.
All those acronyms.
I don't see any of those on your screen here.
Well, not yet. But no, I think like CVEs are definitely part of it. They're definitely a factor, especially in many, many different attacks, right? But similar to the threat variable, like thinking about not just CVEs, but what makes you as an organization vulnerable to a ransomware attack. It, again, surprise, surprise, we can chunk this out in two different buckets. The first bucket, how likely are you to actually be a target for ransomware? Thinking about an attacker that is willing and able to carry out an attack, what makes them want to go after you? In this bucket, there are a couple of things that you can change, a few things you can. Now, that screenshot of, I think that's a refinery, manufacturing site, but if you're in an industry, for example, like manufacturing, energy, the ones that we know historically have faced the most attacks, like attackers have already identified you as, from their perspective, an organization that's potentially more likely to pay a ransom due to your low tolerance for downtime. And so that alone can make you a more desirable target than someone in a different industry, right? You can't change that. What you can change, though, are a few other things. And so, Justin, my understanding is that many of the ransomware as a service operations happening will enable, or I guess help, can you call them customers, help our customers better identify targets by doing things like scanning for open ports that they could use as an entry point, things like that. That's happening, right?
I mean, there's a whole raft of things, right? And it goes on the front end and the back end once kind of the initial foothold has been found. Exploitation of just generic tools, repurposed for lateral movement and discovery, is out there and being leveraged by these ransomware as a service guys.
So those are things that can signal to an attacker, like you are low-hanging fruit as a target, right? But beyond that, if you are targeted and the attacker was able to, at least get into your environment, the likelihood of you being a victim of that attempted attack turning into a successful attack, that's the other bucket for vulnerability. How likely are you to actually get hit? Justin, I know that we're going to talk more about this, or you're going to talk more about this on the next slide. But here we go.
Yeah, so if you look at this is and there's a bunch of other models out there, right? But the idea that as you move left to right, this is how ransomware kind of hits your environment, right? Gains some foothold, looks around and sees what else is out there, what's more interesting. Maybe the foothold was gained on a very uninteresting device, but there's a lot of juicy tidbits later on in the network, and how do we move to those? And then on the right side, kind of where it's deployed, and then finally where it's actually encrypted. And I think what's interesting is that you have from far left all the way up until the encryption stage to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
But once you hit that encryption stage, you're either toast, or you're paying, or you're back, or you're restoring, or you're taking a lot of activity, right? I think anything up to that. And what we've tried to do here is include some basic elements of things that we see people typically trying to do, whether it's scanning for open ports, or you're doing some social engineering activity. Perhaps
you're doing it, or the attacker is doing it.
Yeah, well, if I was putting myself in their position, but exactly, okay. Good point. That, but yeah, these are things that the attacker's doing. So spot on.
Okay.
I think one interesting thing is, and maybe we'll go to the next. We can build this out, right?
So this is what you can do. What they try to do, what you can do in the bottom, right?
Exactly, right. So the first kind of white boxes are things they do, and some efforts we can do on our side to prevent that. And these are things that we typically see on a regular basis, on best practices and so forth. And the idea that, hey, train personnel for phishing, right? Enforce some type of identity control and all that. is obvious, but it's if you take small steps and in these particular areas, I think you're going to find significant results, especially around some segmentation. I think two things I wanted to bring up. One is, CISA has a program that they started, I think, in January of this year, where it's called the ransomware vulnerability warning pilot. And so if they see things that are exposed on the internet or things pop up on their screen, they'll alert and say, hey, look, this is something you need to fix because you could be potentially exposed.
Okay.
I think the other one is, we oftentimes think about this as a machine type of activity, right? The ransomware actors, they'll go out and do this and they'll install a piece of code. But my uncle was actually was social engineered, and he's an older guy. And he received a phone call, said, hey, this is Microsoft SOC calling you. We identified something on your workstation that
oh no
look at. And they're like, look, just run this command and we'll take care of it for you, right? And you can kind of see where the story's going. It's kind of repeatable. We hear this quite often, right? But the idea of social engineering, especially those that haven't had any training, they gain access to your box. Then they start looking around within your workstation as well as your network for this lateral movement. And it's not a sophisticated piece of tech. It's actually guys hammering the keyboard with remote access to your systems, and from there they can deploy code and do other things. And when my uncle called me, I was like, hey, unplug your network, right, and like drop your Wi-Fi immediately, right, to cut all and sever all connections, and then we'll do a RCA from that. So he didn't lose a lot of money. He lost a little bit of money, but I think this is kind of brings home some of this functionality.
I mean, that's a scary story. I'm glad it was only a little bit of money. I thought this was going to take a turn for the worse, Justin, but
he still has his house, so we're good there.
Okay, well, good. But so looking at these different stages and what you can do at each stage, to be clear, you're saying that like if there's an attack that is using phishing for initial access, which is pretty common, like as long as you're able to prevent that phishing email from going through, assuming the attacker has something else up their sleeve, that's going to stop the attack, right? That's going to turn it from an attempt. It's going to stop, right? And so some of these things on here like look relatively simple, all things considered, and some of them, as you move forward, get a little bit more advanced. Justin, what do you recommend for a company that is like maybe a little bit early on their security journey, starting to build a program, but they're worried about ransomware? What are some of the initial things that you would recommend?
I'll just leave with one thought here, and that's the bottom one. I think it's in a little different color purple, but the idea about network segmentation, like that scares that scares me to think about doing a segmentation project, the pain and stuff.
Scares you?
Oh, I've done it, right? And it's extremely hard and painful. I think my recommendation is, start with something super easy. Like, I'm going to go technical a little bit here, but like if you have a /24 subnet, a class C subnet, the idea of dividing it into /25 and breaking it in half and just putting that degree of segmentation, you don't have to re-IP your boxes. You have to change your mask and you have to change your default gateway, but just making those two tweaks is so much more doable that it can complete teardown and a re-architecture of your network. So if you're going to make little steps like /25, /26s, just start dividing the current subnets. You don't have to re-IP. It's a quick win.
Okay. And so for segmentation, I mean, I'm looking at this here. That's going to help with help stopping an attack during command and control and lateral movement. Thinking back to, I don't know, a few slides ago, when we were looking at the historical stuff, I remember those, the TSA directives that came out shortly after the Colonial Pipeline attack. There was one for pipelines, there was one for aviation, one for rail, probably one coming out for maritime. Like, each of those directives has the same like 3 or 4 requirements, and segmentation is a big one. And I remember there being a blurb about like making sure that OT can continue to operate if IT is hit and vice versa. And so segmentation would help with that, right?
Yeah, I think it also provides inspection points, right? As you cut things up, if you divide a /24 in half, now you got two spots to inspect, and if you want to put an access control list at this, then it's that much more granular, and you can make it that much more specific. So that actually will cut down on, kind of moves back into the initial access categories too.
Okay. And keeping in mind too that we know that at least a good chunk of these attacks are not directly targeting OT. OT is just collateral damage. They're starting in IT, they're then moving into OT through various means. When does that typically happen? If it's an IT originating attack, is IT the one that's getting hit with the phishing emails first, and then the attack moves laterally into OT? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think that's the progression, right? Is that phishing is the vast majority, right? Either through links or attachments or websites that people go to, and people typically do that on the IT side. I think there are OT systems that people will use to check Gmail and other things. So if you don't have that blocked, then that should be an early win also.
Okay. One last question for you, Justin. I see we have a question in the chat. What's EDR? I can see that all the way over on the right, you have deploy EDRs with a little star next to it under the payload deployment stage. My understanding is that EDR, so endpoint detection and response tools like CrowdStrike, you can't just go deploying agents on PLCs in your OT network, right? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, you can't deploy EDRs on PLCs, but there are other devices out there in the OT network, engineering workstations and HMIs to some extent, right? You can deploy EDRs on. I think it's a cautious approach, right? There's some you want to do it on if it's a brand new system, it's running the latest and greatest operating systems, right? And and so forth. If it's a legacy, that runs XP, right, that hasn't been patched in 50 years, I would probably not install an EDR on that, just because the chances of breaking it are fairly high. So, but there's also adjacency components to EDR. So you protect the box, but it also understands what the network flow around it is. So even if you install EDR at 50% of your boxes on network, there's a benefit of having a neighborhood type protection.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Awesome. And so, as you said before, after that payload deployment, once you get to encryption and extortion, you really should be focusing on containing the impact, on remediation, on things like that. So with that, I do want us to talk a little bit more about the impact itself. So as we said before, each of these variables can be broken down into different components. If we think about the impact of an attack, generally speaking, there are two different things that can help dictate this. What was compromised? Which assets were compromised, right? How many sites? What's the geographical spread? What's the depth? What are those assets connected to? How critical they are? What are the processes being controlled? If we're talking about OT assets, what is that PLC controlling, right? This is a big part of why it's important to have conversations with the OT asset owners themselves, who are intimately familiar with these assets and processes. They can provide guidance on what the true criticality is, right? Beyond that, extent of the compromise. How bad is it? I know when we talk about IT versus OT, there's, the whole principle of the conflating principles, right? For IT, it's CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, but of data, information, right? On the OT side, it's all about safety first and foremost. And so if the safety of someone is compromised, obviously that makes it a critical event, right? But I think my big takeaway from looking at this is all of those things, how critical something is, what processes is it going to control, what's the extent that it could impact physical safety, uptime, things like that. It's reminding me that you got to know what you have, right? That's why when we talk about visibility, asset inventory, all that stuff is important, because it builds the foundation for this and everything else, right?
Yeah, I think a story comes to mind. I was engaged with a manufacturer, and
Mm,
when we talk about impact, so they did very large heavy industry, and it took them
wow.
about 48 hours to do a system restart, and they got hit by on the IT side by ransomware, and they couldn't process the driver's manifest to get uh, supplies in. They couldn't move products onto from third parties into their environment, and it started grinding to a halt, and they actually had to stop production. And it
Mm.
took about 48 hours for once everything had been reestablished to spin things up. And so all in all, it was roughly a 3.5 day outage, right, where
It's very
a
expensive.
system was impacted but had absolutely direct control of the supply chain of the OT side of things.
And so I think what you're getting at is when we talk about like criticality, it's not just the asset itself, it's everything it's connected to. It's more or less like the system. Like what is that? Like what is the process that that's controlling, that that's supporting? How are these things connected? What are the dependencies, right?
Yep, spot on.
Okay. Actually reminds me, and I'll be brief. I know we're um, a little bit pressed for time, but like Justin, I know you've heard the story of, I think it was before they were a customer of ours, a food and beverage company, like got hit with a WannaCry ransomware attack that after investigation determined that it had come in through a vending machine in the plant. OT was shut down, but the vending machine was the entry point. And when I think criticality, I think, okay, you know, I mean, I like my drinks to be cold. I like them to be there. You know, if that vending machine itself were to be compromised, I might be mildly annoyed. But it's that it was used as an entry point, that there were connectivity paths that weren't at the time known, and that's what happened. So crazy story to think about that, but I think that's another good example of why like understanding interdependencies and things like that is so important.
Yep, segmentation.
Yes, and segmentation, of course. Okay. Next. So with that, talking more about impact, Justin, I know we went back and forth for a couple of
Yep.
days trying to figure out if we were to narrow down what our top 3 recommendations are to reduce impact, what they would be. So
Yep.
I know
You gonna
looking
go
at
first?
this, okay, I'll go first. I'll go first. Sure. So my first one, and it could be because I've worked in security for so long, it could be because I'm biased toward Clarity's offerings, but the it's become a cliche, but the whole like you can't protect what you can't see thing, um, it's real. My thing is embrace it, right? Especially when we're talking about OT, like it's very, very hard to not just mitigate the impact of a ransomware attack, but to really secure much in OT to begin with if you don't have an asset inventory, if you don't have at least the basics down of, what processes are involved, like what are your OT asset owners doing, what versions are running, things like that. And then once you have that information, identify what I'll call your crown jewels. Like what are the assets, the systems that are the most important to your business operations, to things like safety, process integrity, all of that. Once you have those highest priority, truly most critical assets and the other assets are connected to or depend on identified, working back from there in terms of building your response plan around it. That's my first recommendation.
I like it.
Awesome. I'm glad. I hope you agree. And I actually was surprised to see this is not on one of yours. But I think
You stole it first.
I got to it first. Okay. But beyond that, obviously time is money, like especially when we talk about OT. One of the findings from that survey we looked at before, beyond asking about ransomware, we also asked, like, what's the amount of money that you would lose per hour of downtime? And again, I think the average was like $500,000. So for 1 hour, that's nuts. And so the more time you're down, obviously the more money goes out the door. And so having all your ducks in a row as far as an incident response plan that accounts for your crown jewels, but that also like provides quick and easy access to reliable backups, I think flash backups or flash copies, you call them, right, Justin? I know we
Yep.
talked a lot about this earlier, but like that approach enables you to back things up quickly. It's accessible. It's there when you need to restore it. So, my guidance.
I like number 2.
You like number 2 or number 3?
I like number 3 better.
I do too. I do too. So, Justin, do you remember when CISA released the CPGs? I think it was last year. Their CPGs stand for cross-sector performance goals. It's essentially like a simplified version of the controls mapped out in the NIST framework. And it's what CISA is recommending organizations do sort of as a starting point to build their security capabilities, right, to mitigate risk. And this is geared specifically toward critical infrastructure organizations that have OT environments. And one of the recommendations, and it's in the document, like tucked in between, I kid you not, it's like something about segmentation and something else about segmentation, is have a pizza party at least once a year where you bring IT and OT together without any work obligations. And I laughed at this, but in thinking about like how more and more, even of our own customers at Clarity, are IT security leaders that are being increasingly responsible for having to secure OT, as well as the fact that so many of these ransomware attacks are starting in IT before then moving laterally into OT, like having that collaboration also lends itself to having full visibility across the full, your company's full attack surface, like being able to take advantage of the various tech stacks for help by these departments, being able to come up with an incident response plan that accounts for both functions, all of that stuff. So I think I like pizza parties, but also I think what the pizza party is going to help achieve is more important. So.
Listen, I was just excited about the pizza, but I'm all about the party too.
Good.
All right, good stuff, Chelsea. Let's. So I'll talk about my 3. I'm not sure they have any food in them, but and probably not as exciting. But I'll get through it. I'll chat about what I see. So I think the first one is know your dependencies. Like oftentimes we think about not what it is. Like there's adjacent devices, there's peripheral devices, but what if this system goes down? What is it going to stop? What's the dependency? And I think we have to know that and be able to have that documented and out cold. So if something happens, we know how to recover. I mean, there's a reason why what the military spends, 3 to 5 years to train elite warriors, right? It's practice, right? And understanding your environment.
Okay. Yeah, I like it.
My second one is around how to build and how to actually set up things. And I think oftentimes we say, hey, look, let's build really big things, either manufacturing lines or other things, and let's have quantity at scale, right? So the bigger, the faster, the cheaper. But we also need to take into account the idea of how about not building so big, but building linearly, right? So each one is their own discrete individual process. And also like distributing supply chains, right? So the idea that you don't use the same supplier for all 50 lines, right? Maybe you diversify, and so you can build some resiliency into that. I think is very interesting. And it's a long-term play. It's not something we can correct today or tomorrow, but it's for as we think about the future, right? The idea that we want to build adjacency. And finally, sorry, Chelsea, I'll just hit the third one and listen, but it's all about resiliency, right? People will use buzzwords. I know that I've used resiliency to say 18 different things. But the idea for me around resiliency, and I touched on it on the first point, is business continuity, right? How do you make sure that when a system goes down, you can recover within minutes, an hour, but not 3 days? And I think that's what's key. If you can say, I get hit by ransomware, I can recover my system in less than 30 minutes.